back in Matthew chapter 16 this morning. So we're continuing. This is week 2 of a 3-part sermon series, and the series is titled Following the Narrow Road. And so here's what we're talking about. Many of us, as we walk in our Christian lives, we begin to understand that how God works in our lives is that He calls us to certain things. He calls us to certain areas, to go to certain places, to do certain things. And much of our life is made up of this challenge of figuring out what that looks like. What is it that God is calling us to do as people, as in our jobs, in our personal lives, in our romantic lives? What do we do with our free time? What do we do with our service? And how does that all work? How does that come together? The Gospels describe over and over this idea of this narrow gate or a narrow path or this difficult to find way because so many people miss God's work in their lives. So many people miss what it is that God has for them. And so the first message of this series was last week, and that was titled Finding the Narrow Road. And so this idea of, we talked about how if we're driving down the street and we don't know where we're going and we're looking for our turn, it helps to understand what the road looks like. We talked about how if you're going down the road, if I know I'm looking for a class 4, dirt road, or I'm looking for a freeway, that helps me to find where I'm going, knowing what the road will look like. If I'm looking for a freeway, I'm going to look for signs that point me in the direction. I'm going to look for a big sweeping turn going off my road. I'm going to look for an overpass coming in front of me. And likewise, if I'm looking for a dirt road, there's going to be fewer signs, and I will learn to identify that by knowing what I'm looking for. And so last week we said, well, what does that road look like? The main points of that message, if you weren't here, were that as we look at Matthew 16, we recognize that Jesus' narrow road was the cross. That about halfway through his ministry, he started on a new direction, both literally and physically in his body as he traveled to Jerusalem to be killed, and spiritually as he shifted his gaze to this new place that God had for him. So Jesus' narrow road ended at the cross. And so through this passage in Matthew 16, we're looking at how that interacted with his life. And so last week, as we talked about, well, how do we identify this narrow road in our lives? We talked about how often it's not an easy road. It's not smooth and well paved like those 2 roads in Vermont. It's not. We're getting that one better every week. It's not easy. It's not comfortable. We talked about the idea of how we have all these people in our church that work in hospitals. We have a tremendous number of people who work in healthcare. And if one of the nurses in our congregation went to their boss and said, look, if I could just have a couple weeks where I could just have all healthy patients, that would be wonderful. It's been really tough. It's a hard job. If I could just have a week or two where everybody that I cared for was just, they were in good health and they could take themselves to the bathroom and they weren't in pain and they didn't complain, and if they could just walk to the cafeteria and get their own meals, and if everything could be good, that just for a couple weeks. Now, we don't all work in hospitals, but we're aware of what the response would probably be. Well, you're a nurse, you're here to care for the sick. We don't need to pay you to care for those who are healthy. Your role in this place is to care for the hurt and the broken. And as Christians, it's the same thing, that God looks at the world and he says, Christians, I don't need you to go to the healthy places. I don't need you to go to the healthy people. I need you to go to the places where people are sick, where they're dying, and where they're broken. And as such, when we go to those places, as was the case with Jesus, in order to accomplish God's will in a broken place, means walking down a broken road. And the last thing we talked about before we move on, we talked about this last week. I want to make sure we're clear that one of the characteristics of God's call on your life is that it is always an invitation. And it was the idea that if I hand you an invitation, I went to a wedding yesterday, and I got an invitation to that wedding. Now, if I had not gone to that wedding, last night people wouldn't have showed up at my house to break my legs, you understand. Right? Because there wouldn't have been people that were mad at me for not going. I didn't have a contract that said I had to go. The understanding with an invitation is we invite you to this, but you can say no. That we invite you into this. It's a suggestion that we have, but you get to make the choice of whether or not you go. And God's call in your life is such an invitation that you get to say no if you want to. It's his calling to you, his invitation. He wants you to follow him, but you have the opportunity. And here's the reason that's important. Because sometimes things in our life happen that are catastrophic. And some people will say, well, this happened because that was God's path to your life. But that's not the case, and that's not what we're talking about. There's a difference between God calling us, inviting us. He invited Jesus, remember. There are so many times throughout the gospel where it's obvious Jesus knew what was going to happen. He knew he was going to be betrayed by Judas. He knew he was going to be beaten. He knew he was going to be killed. He had the opportunity to run away. He continued to walk to Jerusalem knowing what was waiting for him there. He could have turned around and walked away, but he didn't. And it's important for us to remember that when tragedy comes in our life, out of the blue, out of nowhere, for no apparent reason, that is not God forcing his will on you. That when you lose someone that you care about unexpectedly, that's not God saying, my calling for you is for you to be a person who grieves. He comes into that situation and says, look, my calling for you is to come out of this as someone who has life, and it's going to be hard and it's going to be difficult, but I invite you into that. But God never forces hardship on us because that's his road for our life. Okay? And so the call last week was, okay, go home, let's pray together and say, God, I'm beginning to understand what your road may look like. Show me where you're calling me that I may follow you. And so this week, what we're going to talk about is what it looks like to follow that road. Because here's what happens a lot. We see this all the time. People feel the call of God on their lives, and maybe it's a call to full-time ministry. Maybe it's a call to move somewhere or do something or to live in a certain way, and they start to follow that. But then they get distracted, they get burnt out, something happens, and though they may still be going through the motions, they're not doing it through the power of God, they're not doing it in joy, and they're not doing it in peace. I don't know how many people I've seen in ministry, either full-time or from a lay standpoint, that are just, they're burnt out. You know, they don't enjoy it. When they talk about it, it's always with tiredness in their voice. When they talk about the things they're doing, it's not full of joy. It's not full of peace. It's not with exhilaration for what God is doing. It's just kind of this chore. And that person, to me, is a person that senses God's call in their life. They put on this burden that God is calling them to bear and walk with him as he supports them down this road. And eventually they wander off the path. And they've still got the burden, but they're not walking in God's will where he can support them through it. Because you understand that God never calls you to bear a burden that he won't lift up for you. But so many times in our world, there are people bearing burdens that God has called them to, but not walking on his path where he can help them to lift that up. And so what we're going to talk about today is how do we stay on that path? Once we get on it, once we figure out what God calls us to, what do we actually do to stay there? So let's read our passage. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 28. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of the Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Now we're going to focus on verses 22 through 23 today. I'm going to read those one more time. "And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, 'Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you.' But he turned and said to Peter, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man.'" So here's what happens. Here's our life, okay? We become Christians. We say, God, I want you to be Lord of my life. I want to follow you. I want the path you have for me. We begin to pray. We begin to seek, and then we find it. And this can look like a lot of things. We're not just talking about being full-time pastors here or working in a church. This is everybody, right? So here's some examples of what the call might look like. We already talked about this. We talked about those who work in healthcare. And I don't care if you're a nurse or an LNA or a doctor or an administrator. I don't care if you're a cook. I don't care if you're a janitor. I don't care if you're security. God calls Christians to work in the healthcare system where people are broken, where people are scared and discouraged. And so maybe say, look, I've already been called to this. I'm already doing this job, but God is telling me that I need to look at this as more than a job. Maybe this is my calling, and maybe I can be the one person that really gives this person hope or cares for them and looks after them. Maybe I'm going to be the only person in this building that looks at people with the love of God and not just as broken people who complain a lot. Maybe that's the call God has for you. Another example, we have a lot of this in our church, the education system. I recently finished up a 2-year tour in the education system. And man, there are broken kids. There are so many broken that just come to school in the morning, and you can tell that in the 18 hours since they were gone, haven't received a lot of love. And so, man, it is so important for people in our church to be working in the school system and showing kids what it means to be loved and showing kids what it means to not be identified just by their actions and by their behavior and to care for them and to speak kindly and gently to them. We've got so many people in our church that take in children, whether it's adoption or whether it's through the foster care system or just people that you know that move in with you. And that's a tough calling. It's a hard thing to do to just love that many people. But it's so important to love those children and to care for those children and to be a loving and safe place for them. We have people in our church that are called to singleness or called to married life with childlessness. And it's a calling that we don't talk about a lot in the church, but it is so incredibly important to have people that their family is just the church and that they can just be there to love other people. And man, I got to tell you that as a father of 2 daughters, I appreciate the single people in our lives so much who are just so free to love my kids and be there for my kids. And those of you who are there to help out and to invest in the teens. And man, maybe your calling is just to love everybody around you and to pour yourself out for other people. And so we have all of these things, and the list just goes on. God calls students to be a light in your school, and He calls workers to just be a light in bad working conditions. Man, maybe your job is miserable, maybe it's awful, maybe the working conditions are unsafe, and maybe you're just called to show people what joy looks like in those circumstances. Every single one of us has a call, but then how do we stay on it? Because so often we start out so well and with so much energy, and eventually it's just a burden. And when we get to that point where all we're feeling is burden on our shoulders, what that means is we've strayed from the path where God supports us, where He says, look, if you're going to carry this burden, you got to do it my way, because I've got the way for you to do this where it's sustainable and you can still have joy and you can still have peace. But if you leave my road, if you leave the path I've laid before you, I can't help you over there, and you're going to be on your own. And so often we veer off that path to the point where we're doing nothing but carrying a burden that we were never meant to carry alone, and we were always meant to carry alongside God. So what does Jesus do? Because the New Testament says that Jesus was tempted in every way, just as we are, but was without sin. So remember, this isn't Jesus was just so great and so perfect that He was never tempted to give up the burden, that He was never so great and so perfect that He wasn't tempted to make it off this road. So what did He do to make sure this didn't happen? And our passage talks about it today. So what happens is Jesus is beginning to share with the disciples what He's going to be doing, what He's going to be suffering, and He's looking at this path that's before Him. right? So he's having this conversation with the disciples, and all right, so we've got our cross right here. So Jesus, he's in his ministry, he's helping people, and all of a sudden he shifts his attention to the cross, and he begins to look forward to Jerusalem, both physically and spiritually. So he starts to tell the disciples about it. He says, look, guys, this is where we're going. All of this stuff I'm doing, all of the miracles, all of the healings, this is where it's leading to. This is where it's headed. I am going to be hung on that cross. I'm going to die. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to take all of the sins of the world. I'm going to put them on my shoulders, and they're going to stay there. I'm going to break the chains. I'm going to break the power of death. And he's focused on the cross. And all of a sudden, as he's saying all of these things, Peter says, no. And look where Jesus' focus goes. When Peter says no, Jesus takes his eyes off the cross and he shifts them onto Peter. And so that focus that putting his eyes on the road ahead of him, all of a sudden it's shifted. Now think about this. How many people have been driving down the road in their car and somebody points something out the window? Maybe, let's use a real example. You're on your way to Burlington for the first time, never driven to Burlington, and someone in your car says, why are there whales in that field? Right? And you say, well, I don't know. Why are there whales in that field? And you're looking over here, and then you look up at the road, and all of a sudden you're not on it, right? How many people have done that before? If you have a license, your hand should be up. We've all done that. Now, here's what's interesting to notice. When that happens, you are always off the road on the side that you were looking. If I'm looking over there, I'm off the road on this side. If that's not what happens, you need to get your alignment checked. Automotive fun fact for the day. But when we're looking over there, that's where we always end up. Same principle for those of you who can't drive yet. This is what I learned about all growing up with sports. And this is baseball, this is basketball, this is football. Basketball guys, when you shoot the basketball, where do you look? Come on, Elliot, talking church. Where do you look when you shoot a basketball? You look at the rim, right? Do you look at the crowd? You don't look at the crowd. Because what happens, you look at the rim because we understand in sports that your movement will follow your eyes. That if I go to shoot at a hoop that's immediately in front of me and I look at the right side of the backboard, I am most likely going to miss right unless I overcompensate, right? Same with baseball. And when a pitcher stands on the mound, he looks dead at the catcher's mitt, right? What does a catcher do? If he wants a pitcher to pitch outside, what does he do? He moves over. If he wants a pitcher to pitch low, what does he do? He moves down. If he wants him to pitch inside, he moves to the left, because he understands that where our gaze is directed, our movement will follow. And so a catcher doesn't shift to the left and expect the ball over here because he knows it's less likely to come. Because the pitcher's eye is drawn to the mitt, he looks to the mitt, and everything he does will follow his gaze. It's the same principle. Jesus recognized in this passage that if his gaze was shifted off of the cross and onto Peter, that all of a sudden he was going to begin to veer. Because our motions, our actions, and our lives follow our sight. Everything about what we do and who we are follows where we're looking. And here's what's interesting about this passage. Notice what Jesus says to Peter. He does not say anything to Peter about not saying anything else. He doesn't say be quiet. He doesn't say stop talking. He doesn't say I don't want to hear it. He says get behind me, right? Because for Jesus, it's not about the words. This isn't even about an argument, right? This isn't Jesus saying, well, Peter, stop it because you're going to convince me not to do this. He doesn't say, Peter, I don't like your argument. He doesn't say, stop trying to talk me out of this, because Jesus realizes that this has nothing to do with an argument. This isn't about logic. This isn't about figuring it out. It has nothing to do with the words that Peter's saying. He doesn't say, Peter, stop talking. He says, Peter, get behind me. And he calls him Satan, because Jesus recognizes that this isn't really about Peter. Because Peter's not trying to distract Jesus from his purpose. Peter is just a confused physical vessel that is being used as a distraction to take Jesus' eyes off the cross. Because see, here's what Satan knows. He doesn't have to convince you not to be a Christian. He doesn't have to come in your life and say, look, I know that God gave you a good plan, and I know it sounds great, and I know that there's this road that he's called you to, and you're walking down it, but here's 5 reasons why you should turn around and walk away, right? You're not getting a pop-up ad on your computer that says, you won't believe these 5 reasons you should abandon God's plan for your life. He's not sending you letter. It's not about logic. He understands that if he just comes to you and tries to convince you to abandon God's plan for your life, it's not going to work as well. Satan knows that the easiest way to get a Christian off God's path is a distraction, to get us looking in the wrong direction. He knows that if he can shift your gaze just an inch off the cross, after enough steps, you're going to be in the middle of the wilderness. And this is what was happening with Jesus, and he recognized it. He saw it for exactly what it was. He said, Peter, this isn't you being confused. This isn't about you. He said, Satan, you will not distract me. Get behind me where I can no longer see you. Because Jesus' eyes were on the cross. Satan tried to pull his gaze over here and said, you know where you belong? You belong right here behind me. Because when my eyes are on the cross and you're behind me, there's nothing that you're going to do to distract me. I have a feeling a bunch of people were just making funny faces at me when I did that. Which is fine, because guess what? If I'm turned around, I can't see you. And that's exactly what Jesus is talking about here. He says, look, get behind me. I don't want to look at you. He says, you can keep yapping all you want. You can stand behind me and try and tell me over and over and over that this isn't what I should be doing. But I don't care what you say as long as I can't see you. Get behind me. You're not going to take my gaze. You're not going to distract me. And you're not going to lead me astray. Didn't say anything about be quiet. It wasn't an argument. It was about focus. So often, we miss Satan's work in our lives, pulling us out of God's will because it is so small. Because we expect a full assault. We expect him to try and talk us out of it. We expect these giant, big things that are massive attacks on what we're doing. But Satan knows that. He knows that if he shows up with giant roadblocks, that we're just going to recognize that as his work. When we were adopting Christina, foreign adoption is really complicated. There's tons of paperwork to go through. And man, every time some major hurdle got in our way, we didn't blink. We just said, man, that's Satan trying to get in our way. We weren't distracted. Satan figured that out. He figures that out in our lives. That when he comes with big stuff, when he tries to just stop us in our tracks, we recognize that it's him and we throw him out of our way because we have the power to do that. He doesn't come at us hard. He doesn't come at us head on. He's realized that all he needs to do is make a slight adjustment to your trajectory. And after enough steps, you will begin to fade. And before you know it, you're in the middle of the woods with a heavy burden on your shoulders, still doing the work that God called you to do, but not in the way that God called you to do it. So here's the question for us this morning, church. What is it that distracts you? What is it that Satan does in your life to try and pull you off track? Because he's going to keep doing the same thing to all of us. You see, Jesus was smart enough that when Peter spoke up, he didn't say, man, maybe I should listen, Peter, or maybe you have a good perspective, and he didn't even stop to argue, right? So many of us would be tempted to do that. So many of us, when someone comes and expresses doubt, or when there's this little thing that comes up related to God's plan for us, we're tempted to sit there and argue. But look at what Jesus does. He doesn't sit there and try and explain it to Peter. He doesn't say, well, Peter, let's have a discussion about this. He doesn't say, well, Peter, let's sit down and we'll make a pros and cons list about this. There's no discussion. There's no defense. He spends no time defending his position. He jumps immediately to get behind me. Now, so often, we hesitate to do that. We don't want to overreact. Especially if it's like it was with Peter, a lot of times this comes through other people, right? A lot of the times the distractions in our life comes through even other believers. And it's not because they're bad, it's not because they're evil, it's just because that's the way that it happens, that Satan tries to get at us through all of the people that are closest to us. And so often what we're tempted to do is, we don't want to be rude, we don't want to be mean, we don't want to be uncompassionate, and so we kind of back away from the conflict. We try to explain ourselves. We try and find some mutual ground. We try to work things out and make things fit. But here's the thing. By all accounts, Jesus should have been stronger than we are. By all accounts, he should have been more confident than we are in his purpose. Jesus should have been able to stand up to more temptation, and he should have been able to just be so focused on what God was doing in his life that he was less likely to be distracted, right? And that's how it should work. Jesus should be the best example of the person that can hold up to the most amount of temptation. And yet, Jesus reacts more strongly to what Peter says than we are almost always comfortable doing. Jesus, who should have had the least to worry about, is the one who reacted so strongly. See, this is what happens so often. We believe that Jesus had the ability to stand up to temptation and to persecution because of some inherent goodness, because of just some inherent ability to not be tempted, by something within him that just made him stronger just because of who he was. We like to ignore the fact that Jesus was able to stand up to temptation because he did things like this, because he didn't give it any room in his life. And if his example tells us anything, it's that if he didn't leave any room to be tempted, neither should we. That as soon as something cropped up that could draw his eyes off of the road that God had before him, as soon as anything happened that could possibly pull his gaze from the cross, he completely removed it from his life, set it behind him, and pressed forward. And that's a call for us to do the same. So, church, what is it in your life that distracts you, that begins to pull you off to the side? And here's a hint. It's probably not something that you're worried about. It's probably something that the first time you think of whatever this thing is, you're going to say, oh, that's not a big deal. That couldn't be it. Because that's what's so dangerous about it. Next time you're on the highway or any straight road, just do this. Turn your steering wheel just a little bit to the right. Little enough that you can be careful when you do it. Use your judgment. Don't make those faces at me. But I bet you can be going in a straight line and turn the wheel so incrementally that you can't even see it move. And yet within 150 yards, you'll be in a ditch. Don't go that far. But think about it. When you're driving down the road, you don't have to steer very much, and your car begins to drift. Enough that anyone else in the car, if they were watching you, they wouldn't even be able to tell that you made a movement. Just a slight shift in the weight of your hands, nobody'd ever see it, and yet all of a sudden, if you keep that path, your car is going to be off the road and destroyed. That's the mindset you have to have in your Christian walk, right? Because so often, all we're looking out for is we're looking for Satan to reach up from the back seat, grab the wheel, and yank it off to the side. That's what we're prepared for. That's what we're pushing back against. But that's not what he does, because he knows we're ready for it. Because if I'm sitting in the front seat and I know the guy in the back wants me to crash, if I see his arm coming up, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to knock it out of the way. We're ready for that obvious attack, but that's not what he does. He tries to just put a little bit of weight on the wheel, just enough so that you don't even see yourself drifting until it's too late, until you're off the road, until you're by yourself, until you're alone. And so what does that look like in your life? What is the area where you're distracted, the place you're not even thinking about, the place that it doesn't even seem like a big deal? But before you know it, you find yourself outside of God's grace entirely. Let's